Gray clouds hung low over the jagged peaks as 10-year-old Lucas clutched the weathered map in his trembling hands. 6 months since Mom's accident, and the mountain still felt empty without her laughter. His loyal German shepherd, Ranger, whined softly beside him, sensing his master's grief. They'd been hiking for hours when Lucas spotted it, a small wooden cabin perched precariously on the cliff edge, exactly where the mysterious letter had said it would be, Mom's secret place. The door creaked open, revealing dust-covered furniture and a locked chest beneath the window. Inside lay notebooks filled with his mother's handwriting, and a letter addressed to him dated 1 week after she died. How could his mother have left him a message from beyond the grave? What secrets had she been keeping all these years? And why did the final page contain a warning about the mountains that had claimed her life? Gray clouds shifted across the vast expanse of sky as Lucas stood before the weathered cabin door, his heart pounding so hard he was certain Ranger could hear it. The German shepherd pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort as the boy's hand trembled on the rusty doorknob, turning it with a creak that seemed to echo across the mountainside. 6 months had passed since the accident that took his mother from them. 6 months of hollow reassurances and pitying glances from neighbors. 6 months of his father retreating into silence and late nights. But now, standing before this hidden place that the mysterious map had led him to, Lucas felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt since that terrible day. Hope. The cabin interior was bathed in dust-filtered light, revealing simple furniture draped in sheets like forgotten ghosts. Lucas moved slowly, reverently, his hiking boots leaving prints in the thick dust as Ranger sniffed cautiously at every corner, tail low but curious. The windows, partially obscured by overgrown mountain laurel outside, cast dappled shadows across a small writing desk, where several leather-bound notebooks lay stacked beside a collection of scientific equipment. A microscope, sample vials, a water testing kit, all meticulously arranged despite months of abandonment. Lucas ran his fingers across his mother's handwriting on the notebook covers, each labeled with dates and locations across the mountain range, his throat tightening as he recognized the precise, careful script that used to leave him lunch notes and birthday cards. Opening the first notebook revealed detailed sketches of plant species, water quality measurements from various mountain streams, and photographs taped to the pages showing his mother smiling beside magnificent views. Sometimes alone, sometimes with people Lucas didn't recognize, scientists perhaps, given their matching field gear. A large topographic map covered one wall, dotted with colored pins and handwritten notes about wildlife sightings, water sources, and what appeared to be geological formations of interest. Lucas stared at it, trying to make sense of the patterns his mother had been tracking across the familiar mountains that had been his playground and her workplace. The wooden floorboard creaked beneath him as Lucas moved toward a heavy trunk beneath the window, its brass lock gleaming as if recently polished despite the dust everywhere else. He knelt before it, wondering if the small key he'd found taped to the back of the map would fit, and felt a surge of triumph when the lock clicked open smoothly under his touch. Inside the trunk lay more notebooks, these filled with what looked like journal entries rather than research notes, along with folders of official-looking documents bearing the letterhead of something called Pinnacle Resources, newspaper clippings about land development deals in neighboring counties, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope with his name written on it in his mother's handwriting. Lucas's fingers shook as he opened the envelope, pulled out the letter inside, and felt his blood turn to ice as he registered the date at the top. Exactly 1 week after his mother had died in what everyone had called a tragic hiking accident, the letter began simply urgently, "Lucas, if you're reading this, then I was right about the danger, and something has happened to me. The mountains aren't safe anymore, not since they found what's beneath them, and there are people willing to do anything to keep it secret. Trust no one except Eleanor. The research in these books is the only proof, and now it's up to you to finish what I started before they destroy everything we love about our home." The descent from the mountain seemed to take half the time the ascent had, with Lucas clutching his mother's journals to his chest, and Ranger bounding ahead down the familiar trail, as if sensing his master's urgent need to return home. The afternoon sun had begun its slow retreat behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the weathered cabin they called home at the edge of town. A simple 2-bedroom structure with a sagging porch, where his mother's empty rocking chair still sat, unmoved since the day she didn't come home. Thomas Reed looked up from the stack of past-due notices on the kitchen table, his eyes momentarily brightening at his son's return, before clouding with concern at the sight of the unfamiliar notebooks clutched in Lucas's trembling hands. The boy's words tumbled out in a breathless rush about the hidden cabin, the research materials, and most importantly, the letter dated after his mother's death. "That's impossible, Lucas," his father said flatly, running a calloused hand through his prematurely graying hair as he examined the letter with weary skepticism. "Sarah died 6 months ago. This is just dated wrong. Or maybe it's an old letter she wrote for your future birthday." But Lucas could see uncertainty flickering across his father's exhausted features as he studied his wife's unmistakable handwriting. Their small living room, once warm and filled with his mother's laughter, now felt perpetually cold, despite the wood stove burning in the corner. Photographs of happier times adorned the pine-paneled walls, most featuring the three of them against spectacular mountain backdrops. His mother's environmental research, having kept them living modestly, but contentedly, in this remote town where generations of both his parents' families had lived as loggers, miners, and eventually, park rangers and conservationists. Thomas Reed had retreated into his grief after Sarah's death, taking extra shifts at the sawmill to avoid the empty house while Lucas withdrew into silence, both of them orbiting each other like distant planets. Connected but unable to bridge the void Sarah's absence had created, meals had become perfunctory, conversations reduced to logistics, and the easy laughter that had once defined their family as extinct as the mountain lions his mother had spent years documenting. "Dad, you have to believe me," Lucas insisted, pushing the notebooks across the scarred kitchen table where his mother had once helped with his homework every evening. Mom was working on something important, something dangerous about the mountains, about some company called Pinnacle Resources. But his father's jaw tightened as it always did when conversations veered too close to Sarah, his defensive mechanism against a grief he couldn't process. "Enough, Lucas," Thomas snapped, standing abruptly and pushing the chair back with a harsh scrape against the worn linoleum floor. "Your mother had an accident on a routine survey. These conspiracy theories won't bring her back." And with that, he retreated to the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, leaving Lucas alone in the kitchen with the evidence of his discovery and the painful awareness that the mountain wasn't the only thing standing between him and the truth about his mother's research. Somehow, in the 6 months since her death, his father had become equally insurmountable, transformed from the supportive, laughing dad of his childhood into a hollow-eyed stranger who worked 14-hour days and slept on the couch to avoid the bedroom he'd shared with his wife for 11 years. The morning mist still clung to the weathered fence posts as Lucas made his way down the gravel path to Eleanor Blackwood's cottage, the oldest home in the valley. Nestled against the base of the mountain and surrounded by gardens that had supplied the town with medicinal herbs for over 40 years, Ranger trotted dutifully beside him, occasionally disturbing chickens that pecked freely around the property, their indignant squawks announcing the visitors long before Lucas could knock on the blue wooden door with peeling paint. Eleanor appeared almost immediately, her tiny frame belying the strength in her weathered hands as she pulled Lucas into a fierce hug, the scent of dried lavender and wood smoke enveloping him as she whispered, "I've been expecting you," before ushering him into a kitchen where bundles of herbs hung from ceiling beams and jars of mysterious contents lined open shelves. "You found Sarah's research cabin." "Then," she stated rather than asked, her bright eyes sharp despite her 82 years as she poured Lucas a cup of tea from a kettle that seemed perpetually simmering on her wood stove, the rich aroma of mountain mint filling the cozy space while Ranger settled contentedly at Eleanor's feet, clearly a familiar friend. Lucas nodded, clutching the letter he'd found in the cabin as Eleanor settled into a rocking chair that creaked rhythmically against the uneven wooden floor, her gnarled fingers working automatically at a piece of knitting while her eyes never left Lucas's face. "Your mother was documenting the mountain's ecosystem, creating a biological survey that would establish baseline health markers for the entire watershed," Eleanor explained, her voice carrying the slight lilt of Appalachian cadence that had nearly vanished from the younger generation. But about 8 months ago, everything changed when she discovered contamination in the eastern tributaries, trace chemicals that shouldn't have been there, indicators of mineral extraction, though no permits had been granted for mining operations. The old woman's knitting needles stilled as her expression darkened, deep lines etching further into her face as she continued. "Pinnacle Resources has been buying land parcels throughout the county, small holdings first, then larger tracts, always through different shell companies, so nobody would notice the pattern. But Sarah noticed, started mapping their acquisitions against geological surveys, realized they'd found something valuable under our mountains and were preparing for major extraction. Eleanor set aside her knitting and crossed to an ancient roll-top desk in the corner, unlocking a small drawer with a key she wore around her neck on a leather cord. From within, she withdrew a small brass key attached to a carved wooden tag in the shape of a chickadee, Sarah's favorite bird. 2 weeks before the accident, your mother brought me this, Eleanor said, placing the key in Lucas's palm and closing his fingers around it. She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to you when you were ready, when you started asking questions. It opens a safety deposit box at First Mountain Bank in town. The old woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she took Lucas's face between her palms, studying him with an intensity that made him understand why the townspeople both respected and feared the mountain healer who had delivered most of them into the world. Sarah knew they were watching her. Lucas knew she was getting close to proving what Pinnacle was doing illegally on protected lands, and she was afraid, not for herself, but for what would happen to the mountains, to our water, to your future if she couldn't stop them. The last time I saw her, she told me, if they silence me, the research speaks for itself. But only if someone brave enough can finish connecting the dots. And with those words hanging in the herb-scented air, Eleanor pressed a final object into Lucas's hand. A small, leather-bound notebook different from the ones he'd found at the cabin. Its pages filled with names, dates, and locations, a roadmap of corporate corruption that his mother had documented at great personal risk. The main street of Pine Ridge had never felt so foreign to Lucas as it did that Tuesday afternoon, when he noticed the cluster of men in expensive suits examining maps spread across the hood of a luxury SUV with out-of-state plates, their voices hushed but their gestures animated as they pointed toward the mountain range that had been his playground since infancy. One man, taller than the rest, with silver hair and sunglasses despite the overcast day, seemed to be directing the others, occasionally consulting a tablet and nodding with satisfaction that made Lucas's stomach tighten inexplicably. At Miner's General Store, where generations of mountain families had bought their supplies since the logging boom of the 1922, Lucas overheard Mrs. Abernathy telling old Mr. Jenkins that someone had offered triple the market value for her late husband's hunting cabin on the North Ridge, while across the street at the post office, the usual cluster of retirees who gathered for daily gossip fell silent when the bell above the door announced Lucas's arrival. Conversations about development opportunities and economic revitalization evaporating into uncomfortable nods of greeting. The next morning at school, Lucas arrived early to finish a science assignment and paused outside the teacher's lounge when he heard Miss Harmon, his favorite teacher and his mother's former colleague from the conservation district, speaking in an unusually agitated tone. I don't care what kind of donation they're offering the school, Jim. Pinnacle Resources has a documented history of environmental violations in 3 states. Sarah Reed was investigating them before her accident, and now they're suddenly interested in educational partnerships here? The principal's placating response was too quiet to make out, but Miss Blake, Harmon's chair scraped against the floor as she apparently stood abruptly, declaring, "This community depends on clean water and tourism, not short-term extraction jobs that will disappear when they've taken everything of value," before bursting through the door and nearly colliding with Lucas, her face flushing with embarrassment as she quickly composed herself and offered a too bright smile that didn't reach her worried eyes. The walk home from school took Lucas past the town hall, where a newly erected sign announced a community meeting about economic development opportunities sponsored by Mountain Future Partners. A name he didn't recognize, but that raised the hairs on the back of his neck in a way he couldn't explain. He clutched his backpack tighter, feeling the reassuring weight of his mother's notebooks inside as Ranger, who always waited patiently for him at the school boundary, fell into step beside him with an unusual alertness in his amber eyes. They had just turned onto the gravel road leading to their cabin when Ranger suddenly stiffened, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest as his hackles rose. Lucas turned to see a sleek black sedan with tinted windows moving slowly behind them, maintaining a consistent distance that was neither passing nor stopping, just watching. Ranger positioned himself between Lucas and the vehicle, his normally friendly demeanor transformed into a protective stance that Lucas had never witnessed before. Teeth bared in silent warning as the car continued its slow pursuit until they reached their driveway, where it finally accelerated past them, but not before Lucas caught a glimpse of the driver. The same silver-haired man from town, his sunglasses now removed to reveal cold, calculating eyes that briefly locked with Lucas's in a moment that felt like a silent acknowledgement. A message that made Lucas's blood run cold with certainty that his mother's warnings were not paranoid delusions, but terrible truth. Whatever she had discovered about Pinnacle resources and their interest in the mountain, they now knew her son was following the trail she had left, and they were watching his every move. Dawn had barely broken over the mountain peaks when Lucas set out with Ranger, a small backpack containing water, Eleanor's brass key, and his mother's journals. His father's early departure for an extra shift at the sawmill, providing the perfect opportunity to return to the secret cabin without explanation or permission. The trail seemed to welcome him this time, as if the mountain itself recognized his purpose, with morning birdsong and the occasional scampering of squirrels accompanying their ascent through fog-shrouded pines that dripped with lingering moisture from an overnight rain. The cabin appeared suddenly through a clearing, silhouetted against the brightening sky like a sentinel watching over the valley below. Its weathered exterior revealing nothing of the secrets contained within, as Lucas approached with reverence and growing determination, Ranger circling the perimeter as if keeping guard while Lucas inserted Eleanor's key into the cabin door with trembling fingers. Once inside, Lucas surveyed the main room more methodically than during his first emotional visit, noting details he had overlooked. The precise arrangement of his mother's research equipment, the systematic organization of her field notes, and most curiously, a series of seemingly random markings scratched into the wooden floorboards near the stone fireplace that, when viewed from a certain angle, formed an arrow pointing to a section of the wall beside the chimney. Following the arrow's direction, Lucas ran his hands along the rough-hewn logs of the wall, feeling for anything unusual until his fingers detected a slight depression behind a faded topographical map. Removing the map revealed a small, almost invisible keyhole that matched the unusual notches on Eleanor's brass key. The compartment door swung open silently, revealing a space about the size of a small safe, containing a waterproof case filled with USB drives, a sealed container of water samples, meticulously labeled with GPS coordinates and dates, and a leather portfolio containing photographs and detailed documentation of 3 species Lucas recognized from his mother's conservation work: the Carolina northern flying squirrel, the Appalachian hellbender salamander, and a rare orchid called the small-whorled pogonia, all endangered and all thriving in specific areas of their mountain range that corresponded to colored markers on his mother's map. Beneath these materials lay a thick folder labeled Pinnacle Resources, Contamination Evidence, containing water quality reports, soil samples, analyses, and most damning, a series of photographs showing discolored runoff seeping from several locations where Lucas knew no official mining operations existed. The technical language in the reports surpassed his understanding, but the highlighted sections made the conclusions clear. Heavy metals and chemical compounds consistent with fracking and rare earth element extraction were appearing in watersheds that fed the town's water supply. Lucas spread the materials across the cabin floor, connecting his mother's scattered research into a comprehensive picture of systematic environmental destruction and corporate deception, his hands shaking as he recognized the full scope of what she had uncovered and the danger it represented to those who would profit from the mountain's exploitation. A handwritten note, paper-clipped to the contamination report, stated in his mother's precise handwriting: confirmed toxic levels in eastern watershed, residents showing elevated rates of unusual respiratory conditions and skin disorders, according to Dr. Mendelssohn's confidential patient data. Timeline correlates exactly with Pinnacle's preliminary exploration work through Blue Ridge Holdings subsidiary. The final item in the hidden compartment was a small digital camera with its memory card still intact, protected in a padded case alongside a handwritten note addressed to Lucas that simply read, "The proof is in the images. Trust your instincts about who can help you bring this to light. But remember that money changes people, and Pinnacle has offered fortunes for silence." Words that sent a chill through Lucas as he realized the camera might contain the most dangerous evidence of all: the final documentation his mother had gathered before her fatal accident on a mountain trail she had hiked safely hundreds of times before. Lucas returned home from school to find an unfamiliar luxury sedan parked in their gravel driveway, its polished surface out of place against their modest mountain cabin, with its weathered porch and sagging roof that had needed repairs since before his mother's death. He hesitated at the tree line, Ranger growing tense beside him as muffled voices drifted through the open windows, one of them his father's, and the other belonging to a stranger whose polished, confident tone raised immediate alarms in Lucas's mind. Slipping quietly through the side door into the kitchen, Lucas found his father seated at their scratched pine table across from a man in an expensive charcoal suit. A leather portfolio opened between them, displaying glossy photographs of what appeared to be luxury mountain homes and recreational facilities, while a document bearing the Pinnacle Resources logo sat waiting for signatures beside a checkbook, whose exposed figures made Lucas's breath catch in his throat. "Mr. Reed, as I was explaining," the man continued, not acknowledging Lucas's entrance as he tapped manicured fingers on a survey map of their property. "Your 20 acres represents a crucial connection between parcels we've already secured for the Mountain Vista Resort development. Our offer of $750,000 is significantly above market value, reflecting both our sincere interest and our understanding of your family's emotional attachment to the property." Thomas Reed's weathered face reflected a complex mixture of suspicion and desperate hope as he studied the figures again, his calloused fingers tracing the zeros on the preliminary offer letter while bills stamped "Final Notice" peeked from beneath a stack of mail on the counter. Evidence of the financial strain that had only worsened since Sarah's income had disappeared along with her vibrant presence. "Dad, you can't seriously be considering this," Lucas blurted, dropping his backpack with a thud that finally drew both men's attention. His father's expression immediately hardening into defensive irritation, while the Pinnacle representative's face remained professionally pleasant, though his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Lucas, this is Mr. Harrington from Pinnacle Resources," Thomas said stiffly. "He's presenting an opportunity that could solve our financial situation and provide for your future education." But Lucas could only stare in disbelief at the man whose company name had appeared throughout his process. Mother's damning research, the corporate entity she had been investigating before her suspicious accident. "We don't want to sell our land," Lucas insisted, his voice rising with emotion as Ranger pressed protectively against his leg, sensing his distress. "Mom would never agree to this. Not to people who are contaminating the watershed and destroying habitats for endangered species." Accusations that caused Mr. Harrington's professional smile to tighten fractionally as he smoothly interjected, "Young man, I understand you've recently experienced a tremendous loss, but I assure you Pinnacle Resources maintains the highest environmental standards in the industry. Perhaps you've been listening to misinformation from certain local conservation extremists." Thomas Reed's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as he stood abruptly, gesturing for Lucas to leave the room with a terse, "We'll discuss this later, son," before apologizing to Harrington, who waved away the concern with practiced magnanimity while subtly repositioning the contract and pen closer to Thomas's seat. "The offer remains open for 1 week, Mr. Reed," Harrington said as he prepared to leave 30 minutes later, deliberately ignoring Lucas's glaring presence in the kitchen doorway. "But I should mention that our land acquisition budget for this quarter is nearly exhausted. Delays might necessitate a reassessment of valuation in future negotiations." Thinly veiled pressure that made Thomas's jaw tighten even as he nodded and shook the man's hand, watching from the porch as the sleek sedan disappeared down their rutted driveway, leaving father and son in a tense silence, broken only by the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling above the mountains their family had called home for 4 generations. The science fair display boards lined the gymnasium walls, showcasing the usual volcanoes and plant growth experiments. But Miss Harmon stopped abruptly when she reached Lucas's presentation, her eyes widening as she took in the professional quality water testing data, sophisticated ecological surveys, and detailed documentation of the mountain's fragile ecosystem. What had begun as a simple assignment on local environmental issues had transformed, under Lucas's determined hands, into a comprehensive portrait of their watershed's health, complete with photographs of the Carolina northern flying squirrel in its natural habitat, water quality metrics from 17 different collection sites, and meticulously labeled soil samples showing varying levels of mineral content. "This is university-level research, Lucas," Miss Harmon murmured, her finger tracing the flowchart that demonstrated how contamination in the eastern tributaries would eventually reach the town's water supply within 5 years, based on groundwater movement patterns. Her environmental science background allowing her to recognize the significance of the data that most of his classmates had passed by with only cursory interest. "My mom was tracking these changes for over a year before her accident," Lucas explained, lowering his voice as he pointed to a series of graphs showing increasing levels of specific chemicals associated with mining operations. She found evidence that Pinnacle Resources has been conducting unauthorized exploratory drilling through shell companies, introducing contaminants that are already affecting some of the more sensitive indicator species. Miss Harmon's face paled visibly, her fingers tightening on her clipboard as she glanced around the crowded gymnasium where parents, teachers, and several community members wandered between projects, including the school principal who was currently speaking with two men in business attire near the entrance, one of whom Lucas recognized with a jolt as Harrington from Pinnacle Resources. "Lucas, where did you get all this information?" Miss Harmon asked urgently, her voice barely above a whisper, as she subtly positioned herself between Lucas's display and the sightlines of the men at the door, her normally calm demeanor replaced by an intensity that confirmed Lucas's suspicions that his mother's research was even more significant than he'd realized. "From my mother's research cabin," Lucas answered honestly, trusting the teacher who had been his mother's friend and colleague. "She left everything there: water samples, field notes, photographs of Pinnacle's operations where they aren't supposed to be drilling, even evidence of unusual health problems showing up in communities downstream from their other sites." Miss Harmon nodded slowly, her expression grave as she made several notations on her evaluation form while simultaneously using her body to shield the more damning portions of Lucas's display from casual observation. Her next words measured and careful. "You've earned the highest marks possible for scientific methodology and presentation. But Lucas, you need to be extremely careful with this information. Sarah was meticulous in her research, and if what you're showing me is accurate, there are people who would go to great lengths to prevent this from becoming public knowledge." The science fair concluded with Lucas receiving first place, the blue ribbon a hollow victory compared to the weight of misplace. Harmon's parting words as she slipped him a business card while helping him pack up his materials. "My brother works for the Environmental Protection Agency in their enforcement division. Call this number if you ever feel unsafe, or if you gather enough evidence to build a case. But until then, be selective about who sees your mother's research." Advice that Lucas clutched as tightly as the ribbon when, walking home with Ranger at dusk, he noticed the now familiar black sedan parked at the intersection near their road. Its engine running, but its lights off, waiting. The victory of the science fair faded into distant memory as Lucas stood frozen before his open school locker, staring at the folded paper that had fluttered to the floor when he retrieved his history textbook. The crisp white note contained just 3 words in block capitals: "Stop digging now." Their stark simplicity, more chilling than any elaborate threat could have been. The paper bearing no fingerprints other than his own when he carefully placed it in a Ziploc bag as his mother had taught him to preserve evidence. Throughout the school day, Lucas felt eyes following his movements, his classmates' normal chatter seeming suddenly suspicious as he scanned faces for any sign of knowledge about the note. Finding nothing but the usual teenage indifference, yet unable to shake the sensation of being observed, evaluated, judged as a threat by unseen watchers. The walk home stretched longer than usual, each rustling leaf and snapping twig amplified in his hyper-aware state while Ranger stayed unusually close, the dog's sensitive instincts clearly detecting his master's anxiety as they moved swiftly along the forest path, rather than taking the main road where the black sedan might be waiting. Rounding the final bend to their property, Lucas froze as Ranger suddenly bolted forward, barking furiously toward a cluster of rhododendron bushes near their property line, where a man in dark clothing crouched with a camera sporting a telephoto lens aimed directly at their cabin windows. The stranger scrambled backward as 90 pounds of snarling German Shepherd charged toward him, dropping the camera which shattered against a rock as he fled through the underbrush toward a vehicle Lucas could hear but not see, its engine revving before tires squealed on pavement some distance away. The camera's memory card remained intact despite the broken casing, and Lucas's hands trembled as he viewed its contents on his laptop that evening. Dozens of high-resolution photographs documenting his daily routine, his father leaving for work, Lucas walking to school, close-ups through windows showing the interior of their home, and most disturbing, several clear shots of Lucas entering the trail leading to his mother's research cabin. Sleep eluded him that night as every nocturnal sound became a potential intruder. Lucas positioned his desk chair beneath his bedroom doorknob, placed Ranger on alert at the foot of his bed, and clutched his mother's field journals to his chest like a talisman, the threatening note and memory card hidden beneath a loose floorboard alongside the small brass key Eleanor had given him. Morning brought no relief as Lucas noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud near their mailbox, their distinctive tread matching neither his father's truck nor any neighbor's vehicle. The violation of his security extended to school, where he caught Mr. Peterson, the vice principal who had recently joined their staff, watching him intently during lunch, turning away too quickly when Lucas met his gaze. A movement that sent warning signals blazing through Lucas's mind as he recalled his mother's journals mentioning new Pinnacle employees, integrating themselves into the community months before any official corporate presence was announced. The pieces connected with terrifying clarity that afternoon when Lucas discovered his locker had been searched. The dummy notebooks he'd begun carrying as decoys slightly rearranged, while his backpack's hidden compartment containing his mother's actual research remained undisturbed. They were looking for evidence, for Sarah Reed's documentation of environmental crimes that could cost Pinnacle Resources millions in fines and lost profits, and they knew her son had found her research cache, making Lucas not just a grieving child but a target under active surveillance, a realization that solidified as he stepped off the school bus to find his father in heated conversation with Harrington on their front porch. The Pinnacle representative's face, a mask of concern that never reached his calculating eyes. Eleanor's cottage seemed to withdraw into itself as storm clouds gathered over the mountains, casting the herb garden in premature twilight while Lucas sat at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of tea gone cold. His eyes wide as the elderly woman retrieved a battered metal box from beneath a loose floorboard under her rocking chair. The familiar scratches on its surface matched those Lucas had seen on his mother's field equipment, suggesting years of shared use in the wilderness they both loved so fiercely. "Your mother and I were more than friends, Lucas," Eleanor began, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite the isolation of her cottage. "We were research partners tracking the environmental impact of industrial development across these mountains for nearly 15 years, long before she took the official conservation position with the county." The old woman spread photographs across the table, images yellowed with age showing a younger Eleanor and Sarah Reed collecting water samples, cataloging plant species, and meticulously documenting wildlife populations, their shared passion evident in every captured moment. 8 months before her accident, Sarah found unusual chemical compounds in Blackwater Creek that feeds the town reservoir. Compounds consistent with hydraulic fracturing, though no permits for such operations had been issued anywhere in the watershed, Eleanor continued, producing water testing records with Sarah's distinctive handwriting, noting alarming levels of contaminants. "We traced the pollution to an abandoned mining site that Pinnacle had quietly purchased through a shell corporation called Blue Ridge Holdings, where they were conducting unauthorized exploratory operations for rare earth elements, essential to electronics manufacturing, elements worth billions but devastating to extract." Lightning flashed outside, momentarily illuminating the pain etched into Eleanor's weathered features as she revealed a tattered map marked with red circles, indicating testing sites where contamination levels had increased exponentially over 6 months. The week before she died, Sarah had gathered enough evidence to approach state environmental authorities, including photographs of Pinnacle employees operating drilling equipment on protected land and documentation linking 5 shell companies to their parent corporation. Eleanor's voice broke as she clutched Lucas's hand, her gnarled fingers surprisingly strong. "The day of her accident, Sarah called me from the North Ridge Trail, excited because she'd discovered a hidden access road leading to what appeared to be a major undisclosed operation. She was going to photograph it before meeting with the EPA investigator the following morning." Tears slipped unchecked down Eleanor's face as she revealed the final piece. 40 minutes later, the Forest Service found her body at the bottom of Whisper Falls, a trail she knew better than her own backyard, a fatal misstep that the most sure-footed person I've ever known would never have made on her own. Eleanor pressed a weatherproof notebook into Lucas's trembling hands, its pages filled with chemical formulas and contamination data beyond his understanding, but whose significance was unmistakable from his mother's urgent notations. Sarah knew they were watching her. Lucas knew what would happen if Pinnacle discovered how much evidence she had accumulated, which is why she separated her research between multiple locations and trusted people. The accident report claimed she slipped on loose gravel, but the Forest Service photographs show her boot print stopped 10 feet from the edge, as if she were standing talking to someone, and her camera, the one she never went into the field without, was never recovered. The implications settled over Lucas like the approaching storm, thunder punctuating Eleanor's final revelation. 3 days after Sarah's funeral, my home was broken into while I was visiting your father. Every drawer emptied, every hiding place searched. They were looking for her research, Lucas. And they're still looking, which means they know she found something that could destroy them, something worth killing for. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school parking lot as Lucas hurried toward the bus, already running late after staying to discuss a history assignment, when a battered blue Jeep with Mountain Herald press credentials hanging from the rearview mirror pulled alongside him, and a man with a weathered face and prematurely gray hair leaned across to open the passenger door, introducing himself in a low voice. "Lucas Reed? I'm Marco Delgado from the Herald, and we need to talk about your science project and your mother's research." Something in the journalist's earnest expression and the concerned glance he cast toward the school building where Mr. Peterson stood watching from a window prompted Lucas to slide into the vehicle, Ranger jumping into the back seat as if sensing this stranger posed no threat despite their cautious existence of recent weeks. Marco drove them to a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, selecting a corner booth with clear sightlines to both exits while ordering hot chocolate for Lucas and black coffee for himself, his movements betraying a hypervigilance that matched Lucas's own recent behavior. "I've been investigating Pinnacle Resources for 18 months, Marco explained, sliding a worn leather portfolio across the table containing newspaper clippings, interview transcripts, and water testing results that paralleled Sarah Reed's findings with startling precision. Your mother contacted me 3 weeks before her accident with evidence of unauthorized drilling operations and contamination levels that could classify as criminal negligence if proven conclusively." The reporter's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he revealed a photograph showing Sarah Reed speaking with him at this very coffee shop, her animated expression conveying the passion that had driven her environmental work. "We were building a case together, connecting Pinnacle to 7 different shell corporations operating throughout the watershed, documenting contamination patterns that matched their undisclosed drilling sites perfectly, when suddenly she stopped answering my calls. 2 days later, I heard about her accident." Marco's fingers drummed nervously on his coffee cup as he glanced toward the door each time it opened, his next words confirming Lucas's worst fears. 3 days after your mother's funeral, my apartment was ransacked, my research computer stolen, and my editor received pressure from the paper's major advertisers to reassign me away from environmental stories. Someone didn't want Sarah's research published, and they're still working to ensure it never sees daylight. The journalist studied Lucas intently before continuing. "When I saw your science project, I recognized your mother's methodologies, her data collection patterns, even her graphing techniques. You've found her research cache, haven't you?" Lucas nodded cautiously, still uncertain how much to trust this stranger despite the evidence of his collaboration with Sarah. "Listen carefully, Lucas," Marco continued urgently. "Pinnacle has billions riding on the mineral deposits beneath these mountains. Deposits they can't legally access because of protected species, habitats, and watershed regulations. But they've spent millions buying influence and silencing opposition. Your mother found proof of their illegal operations that could trigger federal investigations, and they'll stop at nothing to contain that information." Marco passed Lucas a prepaid phone with a single number programmed into it, adding, "Use this if you find anything concrete or if you feel threatened. I have contacts at the regional EPA office and the Environmental Crimes Division of the FBI, who can move quickly if we provide sufficient evidence." As they parted, Marco gripped Lucas's shoulder with surprising intensity, his final warning hanging between them like a physical presence. "Trust no one who suddenly shows interest in your activities. Report nothing to local authorities who might be compromised, and above all, secure your mother's research somewhere Pinnacle can't find it. These people aren't just ruthless businessmen, Lucas. They're dangerous criminals hiding behind corporate logos and charity donations, and they've already demonstrated they'll eliminate obstacles to their plans. Whether those obstacles are environmental regulations or dedicated conservationists who get too close to the truth." The Pinnacle Resources contract lay on the kitchen table like a venomous snake, its official seal gleaming under the overhead light, while Lucas stared in disbelief at his father's signature on the preliminary agreement, the traitorous black ink still drying on the page that effectively sold their family legacy for corporate destruction. "How could you?" Lucas whispered, his voice rising as shock transformed into betrayal and rage. "Mom died trying to stop these people, and now you're helping them destroy everything she fought to protect." Thomas Reed slammed his coffee mug down, liquid sloshing over the rim as he pointed an accusatory finger at his son, his face flushed with a mixture of grief, guilt, and defensive anger. "Your mother is gone, Lucas, and her environmental crusade died with her. This money means we can pay off the medical bills from her final hospital stay. save our home from foreclosure, and provide for your future. His voice cracking as he added, Sarah would understand making hard choices for our family's survival. Lucas recoiled as if physically struck, tears burning in his eyes as he clutched the kitchen counter for support, the magnitude of his father's betrayal stealing the breath from his lungs while Ranger whined anxiously, sensing the emotional tempest brewing between the two humans he loved most. You never believed her, never took her work seriously, and now you're helping the very people who might have been responsible for her death, Lucas shouted. The culmination of months of suppressed grief and suspicion, erupting in a torrent of accusations that left his father stunned into momentary silence. Death? What are you talking about? Thomas finally responded, confusion and alarm battling across his features as Lucas revealed everything. Eleanor's suspicions, Marco's corroboration, the threatening note, the surveillance photographs, and the damning evidence his mother had collected proving Pinnacle's environmental crimes. This is madness, Lucas, his father insisted after listening in growing horror. Sarah had an accident on a trail she hiked 100 times. Turning her death into some corporate conspiracy won't bring her back or change the reality that we're drowning in debt with no way out except this offer. The argument escalated until Lucas could no longer bear his father's stubborn refusal to see the truth, his desperate insistence that Lucas was manufacturing connections between unrelated events to avoid accepting the randomness of his mother's death. Without conscious decision, Lucas found himself stuffing clothes, food, and the hidden cache of his mother's research materials into his backpack. Ranger, following anxiously as he stormed from room to room gathering essentials while his father's pleas transitioned from angry demands to worried entreaties. Where do you think you're going? Thomas called as Lucas yanked open the front door, Ranger already bounding into the yard, eager for escape from the emotional maelstrom inside. To finish what Mom started, Lucas answered coldly, not looking back as he strode into the gathering dusk, his father's voice fading behind him as he headed toward the mountain trail. His destination, the only place he still felt connected to his mother and her mission. The climb to the research cabin passed in a blur of tears and determination, the familiar path now shadowed by nightfall, requiring Ranger's superior senses to navigate safely. But Lucas pressed forward relentlessly, propelled by the burning certainty that his mother's cabin represented their last hope of exposing Pinnacle's crimes and preventing his father's misguided contract from facilitating further destruction of their beloved mountains. Thunder shook the cabin's wooden frame as rain lashed against the windows with relentless fury, the mountain storm having descended with unexpected ferocity shortly after Lucas arrived, transforming the peaceful sanctuary into an island surrounded by treacherous muddy slopes and swollen streams that made descent impossible. Ranger huddled near the stone fireplace where Lucas had managed to coax a small blaze, the dog's usually playful demeanor subdued by the violent weather and his master's somber mood, as Lucas spread his mother's research materials across the rough-hewn table. Lightning illuminated the room in stark white flashes as Lucas discovered a leather journal he hadn't noticed before, wedged behind the desk drawer, and only visible now because he'd pulled the furniture away from the wall to be nearer to the fire's warmth. The journal's final entries were dated in the week before his mother's death, the handwriting increasingly hurried and agitated compared to her typically meticulous notes. Met with Harrington today. Read the entry from 3 days before her accident. Confronted him with water quality reports showing cadmium and arsenic levels 300% above legal limits downstream from their exploratory sites. He denied Pinnacle's involvement despite evidence linking Blue Ridge Holdings to their parent company, then shifted to offering me a consulting position with a salary that could pay off our mortgage in 2 years if I would redirect my research focus to more productive areas. The next entry sent chills through Lucas despite the fire's warmth. Someone followed me from town today, black sedan with tinted windows, same vehicle I noticed outside the school when I picked up Lucas yesterday. Called Marco to move up our meeting with the EPA contact, too dangerous to wait until next week's scheduled appointment. Thunder cracked directly overhead as Lucas turned to the final entry, dated the morning of his mother's death. Meeting Harrington's boss today at their request, claimed they want to resolve our differences regarding the Watershed Protection Initiative. Taking all documentation with me as leverage, but left backup research distributed between cabin, Eleanor, and safe deposit box as precaution. Something feels wrong about this meeting. Location changed twice already, now insisting on meeting at Whispering Falls Overlook, remote but I know the area well. The journal ended there, the remaining pages blank accusations of a story forever unfinished. A life abruptly terminated on that remote trail where Sarah Reed supposedly suffered a tragic accident, but where Lucas now understood with crystalline clarity she had been deliberately silenced. Tears blurred his vision as he clutched the journal to his chest, the storm outside a pale reflection of the emotional tempest within as pieces locked into place. His mother hadn't slipped. She had been pushed or forced from that cliff after refusing whatever offer Pinnacle's executives had made to buy her silence. Her death classified as an accident because who would question an experienced hiker having a moment of carelessness on a familiar but dangerous trail? Through the long night as the storm raged unabated, Lucas read and reread those final entries, his grief transforming into resolute determination while Ranger stood sentinel at the window, occasionally growling at sounds beyond the howling wind. Both boy and dog somehow sensing they were not alone on the mountain despite the tempest, that somewhere beyond the storm's fury, the same forces that had silenced Sarah Reed were closing in on her son and her damning evidence. Dawn broke with deceptive calm after the night's tempest, pale light filtering through lingering clouds as Lucas gathered his mother's research into his backpack. The cabin floor still scattered with papers he'd been studying, when Ranger's low growl at the window halted his movements, peering cautiously through rain-streaked glass. Lucas's blood turned to ice at the sight of three men in dark rain gear making their way up the muddy path, their methodical movements and communication devices marking them as professionals rather than hikers caught in the storm. Ranger's hackles rose as Lucas frantically stuffed the remaining journals into his pack, knowing they had minutes at most before the men reached the cabin. Their purposeful advance leaving no doubt about their intentions. They had tracked him, perhaps following his impulsive flight from home, or using the surveillance they'd already established to anticipate his destination. With trembling hands, Lucas retrieved his mother's topographical map from the wall, the detailed rendering of the mountain's hidden paths and trails, annotated in her precise handwriting with notes about seasonal accessibility and points of caution. One route in particular caught his eye. Marked Spring Runoff Bypass, a narrow trail behind the cabin that followed a seasonal creek bed before connecting to an abandoned logging road on the mountain's eastern slope. The security team's voices became audible outside just as Lucas shouldered his pack and slipped through the cabin's rear window. Ranger, following silently as years of accompanying his mother on research expeditions, had trained the German Shepherd for stealthy movement through wilderness. They pressed their bodies against the cabin's rough exterior, inching toward the creek bed path as the cabin door creaked open and masculine voices filled the space they had occupied moments before. "Search everything. The research must be here somewhere." A commanding voice ordered as Lucas and Ranger slipped into the dense undergrowth, the boy's heart hammering so loudly he feared it would betray their position mere yards from the cabin's rear wall. The spring runoff path proved treacherous after the night's deluge, more flowing creek than walkable trail, but Lucas recognized landmarks from countless hikes with his mother. The lightning-struck oak that marked the first turn, the peculiar rock formation she'd called Turtle Back that indicated a difficult but navigable shortcut. Behind them, shouted commands, and the crashing of brush signaled the security team had discovered their escape and begun pursuit. Their greater size both advantage and liability on the narrow mountain paths now slick with mud and debris. Lucas's knowledge of his mother's secret routes proved decisive as he led Ranger along a nearly invisible game trail that cut beneath a rock overhang, the security team continuing straight past their position. Following the more obvious path, minutes stretched into an hour of careful navigation as Lucas consulted the map at each junction, his mother's notations guiding them away from washouts and towards stable passages despite the storm damage. A fallen tree provided momentary shelter as Lucas consulted the map again, plotting a route toward the eastern valley where Marco had agreed to meet him in case of emergency. The sound of engines in the distance confirmed his suspicion that additional security personnel had been deployed to block obvious exit routes, the corporate team's resources allowing them to coordinate a sophisticated search operation even in these challenging conditions. Sunlight occasionally pierced the clouds as Lucas and Ranger forded a swollen stream, the dog swimming powerfully beside his young master, as they committed to a route that would take them farther from home but closer to safety. Behind them, the distant shouts grew fainter as the mountain itself seemed to protect its own, concealing their trail with fresh mudslides and obscuring their tracks with rivulets of continuing runoff. Nature becoming an unexpected ally in their desperate flight from those who would destroy it for profit. The afternoon sun broke through, dissipating clouds as Lucas followed the final markers on his mother's map, Ranger bounding ahead with renewed energy after their harrowing escape, the dog's nose leading them through a narrow passage between towering rock formations that Lucas would have missed entirely without the detailed annotations guiding his way. The passage suddenly opened to reveal a sight that stole Lucas's breath and stopped him mid-step, his exhausted legs momentarily forgotten as he gazed upon a hidden valley cradled within the mountain's protective embrace. Sunlight illuminated an emerald paradise untouched by human development, a secret ecosystem his mother had mapped but apparently told no one about. Its location marked on her topographical charts with the simple notation, Sanctuary. Crystal clear water bubbled from a spring at the valley's center, forming a pristine pool before meandering into a stream that disappeared into the forest beyond, its banks carpeted with plants Lucas recognized from his mother's endangered species documentation. The rare, small, whorled pogonia orchids grew in abundance here, their delicate structures nodding in the gentle breeze alongside the threatened Virginia round-leaf birch trees she had spent years cataloging throughout the range, but never in such concentration. Lucas moved forward in reverent silence, recognizing immediately the ecological treasure he had stumbled upon, a perfect, self-contained ecosystem untouched by the contamination affecting surrounding watersheds, a living laboratory of biodiversity that would be obliterated if Pinnacle Resources began their planned operations. Kneeling beside the spring, Lucas understood with sudden clarity why his mother had kept this place secret even from her conservation colleagues. This valley contained irrefutable evidence of what stood to be lost, a baseline comparison that demonstrated the devastating impact of mining operations on water quality and endangered species habitat, living proof that would be more powerful in environmental court than any scientific report or expert testimony. Ranger lapped thirstily at the pool while Lucas consulted his mother's journal, finding a passage that confirmed his revelation. The Sanctuary Valley contains 17 endangered plant species and provides critical habitat for the Carolina northern flying squirrel, its water chemistry perfectly balanced and showing no traces of industrial contamination. This pristine ecosystem sits directly above the largest rare earth mineral deposit, according to Pinnacle's geological surveys, making it ground zero for their planned excavation and certain ecological destruction. Lucas photographed everything with the waterproof camera from his backpack, documenting the rare plants, the crystal-clear spring, and the thriving wildlife that had established perfect harmony in this hidden refuge. Understanding now why his mother had fought so fiercely and what had made her dangerous enough to silence, this valley wasn't just a beautiful secret. It was ecological evidence that would stand up in court. A perfect control group demonstrating what healthy mountain ecosystems should look like compared to the contaminated watersheds downstream from Pinnacle's operations. As sunlight illuminated a family of rare golden eagles nesting on the valley's western ridge, Lucas felt his mother's presence more strongly than at any moment since her death, her passion for conservation suddenly making perfect sense as he witnessed firsthand the irreplaceable treasure she had died protecting, a legacy more valuable than any mineral deposit or corporate profit margin. Thomas Reed paced the empty house for the third sleepless night since Lucas had disappeared, his initial anger at his son's dramatic departure now transformed into gnawing fear, amplified by the violent storm that had raged across the mountains. Each unanswered call to Lucas's cell phone deepened the hollow ache in his chest, a familiar sensation of helplessness he had experienced daily since Sarah's death, but now sharpened by the terrifying possibility of losing his son to the same mountains that had claimed his wife. Desperation drove Thomas to search Lucas's room for any clue to his whereabouts, finding nothing until his fingers detected a loose floorboard beneath the faded rug where Lucas kept his most treasured possessions. The hidden compartment revealed a cache of photocopied journal pages, water testing reports, and photographs that Thomas initially dismissed as part of his son's science project, until he recognized Sarah's handwriting documenting elevated toxin levels in local water sources, alongside photographs of unmarked drilling equipment on protected land. The night stretched endlessly as Thomas spread the materials across the kitchen table, the same surface where he had signed the preliminary agreement with Pinnacle Resources, his eyes burning from fatigue and unshed tears as connections he had refused to see began forming with undeniable clarity. Dates of Sarah's documented contamination aligned perfectly with Pinnacle's quiet land acquisitions through shell companies. Unusual health issues in downstream communities corresponded with periods of increased activity at unmarked sites, And most damning, Sarah's final journal entries revealing her scheduled confrontation with Pinnacle executives on the very trail where she later died. Coffee grew cold in his trembling hands as Thomas examined a map marking Pinnacle's proposed development zones, the intended excavation sites, forming a pattern that encompassed their family property and extended across the watershed Sarah had spent years documenting and protecting. The realization struck him with physical force that in his grief focused solely on financial survival, he had aligned himself with the very entities his wife had died opposing, potentially making himself complicit in the destruction of her life's work. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Sarah's parents, chimed 3 in the morning as Thomas finally acknowledged the truth he had been too broken to see. His wife's death had shattered him so completely that he had abandoned her values along with her memory, retreating into a narrow focus on immediate problems, rather than the larger principles that had defined their life together and shaped their son's passionate defense of her legacy. Dawn found Thomas still at the kitchen table, red-eyed but resolute, as he gathered the evidence into a folder and placed a call to the family lawyer, requesting an immediate review of the preliminary agreement he had signed with Pinnacle Resources and exploring options for legal withdrawal. As morning light illuminated the familiar mountains through the window, Thomas reached a decision that felt like the first clear thought he had experienced in 6 months of fog, picking up his truck keys and a detailed trail map with a single destination in mind. The research cabin where his wife had conducted her most important work and where his son had likely sought refuge, both from the storm and from a father too, lost in his own grief, to recognize the courage and conviction that made Lucas so unmistakably Sarah's son. The Sanctuary Valley's natural cave provided perfect shelter as Lucas, Eleanor, and Marco spread their collective evidence across a flat rock surface, illuminated by lantern light. The unlikely alliance of a 10-year-old boy, an elderly mountain healer, and an environmental journalist united by shared purpose and the common thread of Sarah Reed's research. Their hushed voices echoed softly against stone walls as they cataloged what they had versus what they still needed to build an irrefutable case against Pinnacle Resources. The water samples from your mother's research establish historical contamination patterns, Marco explained, organizing the collection of testing vials Lucas had carried from the cabin. But we need current samples from specific locations that can be definitively linked to Pinnacle's operations, with proper chain of custody documentation that would stand up in court. Eleanor's gnarled fingers traced routes on the topographical map, identifying 3 critical watershed junctions where contamination would be most concentrated and therefore most easily detected. Her lifetime knowledge of mountain water systems proving invaluable as she added, the eastern tributary below their primary drilling site will show the highest concentrations of heavy metals, but we need comparative samples from unaffected streams to demonstrate the difference. Ranger kept watchful guard at the cave entrance as Lucas shared his discovery of the Sanctuary Valley, its pristine ecosystem providing the perfect control group for comparison, while Marco revealed contacts at 2 environmental testing laboratories willing to process samples confidentially, circumventing local facilities that might have connections to Pinnacle. We also need corporate documentation, linking the shell companies to Pinnacle, Marco continued, spreading photocopies of business filings across the makeshift table. Sarah had begun establishing these connections, but we need internal communication or financial records proving Pinnacle directs these subsidiaries. Eleanor produced a small leather address book from her pocket, identifying 3 former Pinnacle employees who had left the company after raising environmental concerns, potential whistleblowers who might provide crucial testimony if approached carefully. The plan took shape methodically. Lucas would guide them to critical water sampling locations using his mother's maps while documenting the current state of contamination with photographs and GPS coordinates. Eleanor would leverage her network of locals who had experienced property damage or health issues potentially connected to the mining operations, building a catalog of human impact. And Marco would approach his contacts within the Environmental Protection Agency and the State Attorney General's office once sufficient evidence was secured. We'll have one chance to make this case, Marco cautioned, his expression grave as he outlined the powerful forces they faced. Pinnacle has political connections at every level of state government and enough lawyers to bury environmental complaints for years in litigation. The rising moon cast elongated shadows through the cave entrance as they finalized their strategy, each understanding the personal risk but equally committed to completing Sarah Reed's work. They would begin collecting samples at dawn, focusing first on the watersheds closest to Pinnacle's active operations before their planned meeting with Marco's EPA contact in 3 days, a deadline that left no room for error or hesitation. Lucas sealed his mother's journals in waterproof containers, as Eleanor prepared collection vials and Marco verified his recording equipment, their diverse skills combining into something stronger than each could accomplish alone, a living embodiment of Sarah Reed's belief that truth and evidence, properly documented and strategically deployed, remained the most powerful weapons against corporate exploitation and environmental destruction. The chain-link fence surrounding Pinnacle's unmarked facility gleamed under moonlight as Lucas assessed the narrow drainage pipe his mother had documented in her field notes, the concrete cylinder just wide enough for his slim frame, while Marco, too large to fit through the opening, prepared collection vials and testing equipment on the forested side of the perimeter. Ranger positioned himself on a small rise overlooking the facility, his keen senses more reliable than any electronic warning system, as Lucas wriggled through decades of accumulated sediment, emerging inside the restricted area where holding ponds contained murky water that should have been properly treated before release into the watershed. The facility stood eerily quiet at this late hour, only security lights illuminating collection tanks and processing equipment, as Lucas moved with practiced stealth between shadow pools, his hiking boots wrapped in cloth to minimize footprints and sound, while he navigated to the primary discharge point his mother had identified as the most concentrated source of contamination. The collection process required precision and patience, with Lucas following Marco's whispered instructions through a two-way radio as he gathered samples from progressively deeper water levels, each vial carefully labeled with GPS coordinates and timestamps to establish unbroken documentation acceptable to environmental authorities. The discharge water shimmered with unnatural iridescence, its chemical odor burning Lucas's nostrils as he secured multiple samples, including sediment from the pond bottom, where heavy metals would naturally concentrate. Security floodlights suddenly blazed to life on the far side of the facility, accompanied by the distant sound of voices as the night shift made their rounds, prompting Lucas to flatten himself behind a collection tank, while Ranger's distinctive 3 short barks through the radio signaled approaching danger from another direction. Heart pounding against his ribs, Lucas waited for a momentary gap in the security patrol before sprinting to the drainage culvert, only to freeze mid-stride when a powerful flashlight beam swept the area just yards from his position, forcing him to dive beneath a maintenance vehicle as boots crunched on gravel mere feet from his hiding place. The security guards conversed casually about engine trouble with one of the trucks, their prolonged inspection of the vehicle sheltering Lucas creating agonizing minutes of exposure while the water samples rested precariously in his backpack, their contents potentially revealing enough evidence of Clean Water Act violations to trigger federal enforcement. When the guards finally moved toward the main building, Lucas seized his opportunity, scrambling toward the drainage pipe and pushing the sample containers ahead of him before wiggling through the narrow opening where Marco waited with visible relief, quickly securing the samples in specialized containers designed to preserve chemical composition during transport. They retreated swiftly into the forest as facility lights illuminated the perimeter, suggesting their presence had perhaps triggered some security protocol despite their careful approach. Ranger led them along an unmarked game trail that provided cover from potential pursuit, the precious water samples nestled in Marco's reinforced case, representing the most damning evidence yet of Pinnacle's environmental crimes. Dawn found them miles from the facility, exhausted but triumphant, as Marco performed preliminary field tests that confirmed their suspicions. Cadmium levels exceeded legal limits by over 400%. Arsenic and lead concentrations pointed to severe heavy metal contamination, and chemical markers unique to Pinnacle's extraction process provided a definitive fingerprint linking the pollution directly to their operations, evidence that Marco immediately documented with photographs and detailed notes before they continued toward the meeting point, where Eleanor waited with transportation to the independent laboratory that would provide official, court-admissible testing. The Pinnacle Resources Office occupied the top floor of the only modern building in town, its gleaming glass and steel architecture a stark contrast to the rustic businesses lining Main Street, as Thomas Reed stepped from the elevator into a reception area where mountain photographs seemed a calculated attempt to present the Thomas Reed Company as environmentally conscious. The receptionist's plastic smile faltered when he insisted on seeing Harrington immediately, without an appointment, his determined stance and barely contained anger eventually prompting a call that brought the executive from his corner office with a practiced look of concern. "Mr. Reed, What an unexpected pleasure. Harrington began, ushering Thomas into a conference room with panoramic views of the very mountains Pinnacle planned to hollow out. I trust you've had time to review the final contract details. Thomas remained standing, placing Sarah's research journals on the polished table between them, watching as recognition flickered across Harrington's carefully composed features before the corporate mask slipped back into place. My wife didn't have an accident, did she? Thomas asked flatly, his voice steady despite the rage and grief churning beneath the surface. She found evidence of your illegal operations, your contamination of the watershed, and she was going to expose Pinnacle to federal authorities. Harrington's expression shifted subtly, calculation replacing courtesy as he assessed Thomas with new interest, making no move to deny the accusation but instead responding with practiced precision. Sarah was a brilliant scientist but unfortunately misguided in her interpretation of preliminary data. Accidents in these mountains are tragically common, even for experienced hikers. The executive's casual dismissal of Sarah's death ignited something primal in Thomas, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he leaned across the table. I'm withdrawing from our agreement and taking my wife's research to the authorities. Harrington's laugh lacked any warmth as he opened a laptop and turned it to display surveillance photographs of Lucas and Marco collecting water samples at Pinnacle's facility, additional images showing Eleanor's cottage and the mountain paths leading to the research cabin, the comprehensive surveillance operation revealing just how closely they had been tracking the family. Your son has been quite busy continuing his mother's misguided crusade, Harrington remarked with calculated casualness, trespassing on private property, removing materials without authorization, collaborating with discredited journalists with personal vendettas against successful corporations. These are serious legal matters, Mr. Reed, especially for a minor already struggling with the trauma of losing his mother. The implied threat hung in the air between them as Harrington continued. Mountain environments can be so unpredictable, so dangerous for a young boy and his dog wandering unsupervised through unstable terrain, particularly with more storms forecast this week. Thomas felt ice form in his veins as the executive closed the laptop and straightened his tie. The message unmistakable. Lucas was being watched, followed, and potentially targeted just as Sarah had been before her accident, confirming every terrible suspicion that Thomas had tried to dismiss as his son's grief-induced conspiracy theories. Consider carefully what matters most, Mr. Reed, Harrington concluded as he opened the conference room door in clear dismissal. Your family's financial security through partnership with Pinnacle, or pursuing unfounded allegations that would only bring further pain and potentially more tragic accidents to what remains of your family, leaving Thomas standing alone with the horrifying certainty that his wife had been tragic, murdered for her discoveries, and his son was following the same dangerous path toward a confrontation with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate obstacles permanently. The safety deposit box key burned in Lucas's palm as he stood before the bank teller, his voice steadier than his racing heart as he presented the identification Eleanor had helped prepare. The bank manager's curious glance at the young boy requesting access was quickly redirected by Marco's press credentials and explanation about a feature story on local youth financial education, securing their entry to the vault where box number 317 waited untouched since Sarah Reed had last accessed it. Inside the metal container lay a waterproof camera case, its seal unbroken despite months of storage, containing his mother's professional-grade digital camera, along with 3 memory cards carefully labeled with dates and locations in her precise handwriting. Lucas's hands trembled as he powered on the device, the battery miraculously retaining enough charge to illuminate the preview screen, where the final images his mother had captured sprang to life with devastating clarity. Systematic documentation of unmarked drilling equipment on protected lands, workers in Pinnacle uniforms operating machinery without required containment systems for toxic runoff, and most crucially, time-stamped photographs of waste discharge pipes emptying directly into tributaries, feeding the town's water supply, all dated weeks before any permits had been approved or applications acknowledged. Marco whispered hoarse exclamations as they scrolled through the damning evidence, each image more incriminating than the last, establishing a clear timeline of illegal operations that violated numerous federal environmental regulations. But it was the final sequence of photographs that caused Lucas's breath to catch painfully in his chest. The timestamp showed 10:17 a.m. on the morning of his mother's death, the location unmistakably Whispering Falls overlook where her body had later been discovered. The series of 4 images captured Sarah's confrontation with Harrington and the silver-haired executive Lucas had seen watching him in town. Their faces contorted with anger as Sarah apparently refused whatever they were proposing. The final photograph showing Harrington grasping her arm, while the older executive reached for her camera. The image slightly blurred, suggesting she had taken it hurriedly before the men could stop her. She knew, Lucas whispered, tears streaming unchecked down his face as the truth crystallized with terrible clarity. She knew they would try to take the camera, so she removed the memory card before they could get it. Marco studied the images with professional assessment, immediately recognizing their legal significance. This is the evidence chain we needed. Lucas, proof of Pinnacle operating without permits, documented environmental violations, and clear confirmation that the executives confronted your mother on the exact trail where she supposedly had her accident just hours later. The bank manager's discreet knock indicating their time was running short prompted Marco to quickly transfer the images to his encrypted laptop, preserving the original memory cards as evidence, while creating backup copies of the devastating visual proof that transformed Sarah Reed's death from tragic accident to something far more sinister. Lucas carefully rewrapped the camera in its waterproof case, this tangible connection to his mother's final hours both painful and precious, as he whispered a silent promise to complete the work she had begun, to ensure that her final act of courage would not be in vain, but would instead become the catalyst for justice against those who had taken her from her family and threatened the mountains she had died protecting. Twilight shadows lengthened across the cabin floor as the door creaked open, revealing Thomas Reed standing breathless and haggard in the entrance. His eyes wild with fear and relief upon finding Lucas seated at his mother's desk. The tension between them crystallized in the silent moment before Thomas crossed the room in 3 desperate strides, pulling his son into an embrace so fierce it conveyed everything words had failed to express since Sarah's death. "I was wrong, so wrong about everything," Thomas whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking as Lucas initially stiffened against him before slowly yielding to the embrace, Ranger circling them with soft whines of canine approval at the reunion. "I found your mother's research, saw the evidence against Pinnacle," confronted Harrington. Thomas continued, releasing Lucas to kneel before him at eye level, his weathered hands gripping his son's shoulders as he confessed, "They threatened you, showed me they were tracking you. And I realized with horrible clarity that everything you said about your mother's accident was true." Lucas studied his father's face, seeing in the red-rimmed eyes and new lines of worry the transformation from disbelieving skeptic to fearful believer. A conversion purchased at the terrible cost of knowing his wife had likely been murdered and his son targeted by the same forces. "We found her camera," Lucas responded, his voice small but steady as he described the safety deposit box contents, the photographic evidence of Pinnacle's operations, and most devastatingly, the final images showing Sarah's confrontation with the executives at Whispering Falls. Thomas sank into a chair, grief and guilt washing over him in visible waves as Lucas retrieved the sealed letter from his backpack. The final communication Sarah had written to her son with prescient understanding of the dangers she faced. Together they broke the seal, their heads bent close as they read Sarah's last words by lantern light, her distinctive handwriting flowing across pages that contained not just evidence and instructions but a mother's love extending beyond her death. "My dearest Lucas, if you're reading this, then my confrontation with Pinnacle ended as I feared it might. But know that every choice I made was to protect our mountains, our community, and most importantly, your future, in a world where clean water and untainted land remain your birthright rather than corporate commodities." Thomas read aloud the passages where Sarah expressed her pride in Lucas's developing environmental consciousness, her confidence that he would someday continue her conservation work with the same passion that had defined her career, her voice seeming to fill the cabin through her written words as father and son absorbed her final wishes together. The letter concluded with a passage that pulled tears from both of them. "If something happens to me, know that my research speaks the truth that powerful interests want silenced. But truth finds its voice through those brave enough to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the mountains, for the watersheds, for the future generations who deserve to drink clean water and breathe unpolluted air. Trust Eleanor, find allies who share our values, and know that my love for you transcends whatever happens to my physical presence, remaining in every tree we identified together, every stream we tested, every trail we walked as I taught you to love this mountain as I have loved you, completely and without reservation." As night settled fully upon the mountain, Thomas and Lucas remained together in the quiet cabin, united in grief but also in purpose. The chasm between them bridged by Sarah's words and the shared determination to honor her legacy by completing the work that had cost her everything. The town hall overflowed with residents spilling onto the sidewalk outside, the ancient building never having hosted such a contentious gathering as Thomas Reed stood at the podium with Lucas beside him. The evidence of Pinnacle Resources' environmental violations projected on the wall behind them, contaminated water samples, illegal drilling operations, and most damning, the final photographs from Sarah Reed's camera showing her confrontation with executives hours before her fatal accident. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as Thomas methodically presented each piece of evidence, his voice steady, despite the emotion visible in his tense shoulders and the protective hand he kept on Lucas's shoulder. "My wife gave her life to protect these mountains and our community's future," Thomas concluded, his words hanging in the charged atmosphere as Lucas stepped forward to explain the Sanctuary Valley's ecological significance and the irreversible damage Pinnacle's planned operations would cause to the watershed, providing their drinking water. The room erupted into chaos as Mayor Wilson called for order, the community fracturing visibly along lines of environmental concern versus economic desperation. Eleanor stood with a contingent of multi-generation mountain families, her authoritative voice cutting through the din as she reminded everyone how their ancestors had survived the collapse of previous extraction booms while depending on clean water and sustainable forestry. "My great-grandfather worked these mountains responsibly," called out Jim Harkins, a fourth-generation logger whose family had practiced selective harvesting for over a century. "And he taught us, you never poison the land that feeds you, no matter how desperate times get." Opposition formed just as quickly around Bob Mercer, recently laid off from the furniture factory that had relocated operations overseas, who stood with several dozen similarly struggling families to argue passionately that Pinnacle represented their only chance at economic survival. "Environmental concerns won't put food on my children's table or keep the bank from taking my home." The debate intensified as Marcus Jenkins, whose daughter had developed mysterious respiratory problems, demanded explanation for the elevated contaminant levels in their well water, while Town Council member Peterson, recently revealed as a paid Pinnacle consultant, attempted to discredit the water testing methodology. Miss Harmon arrived with her entire science class in tow, the students carrying poster-sized graphs comparing water quality in protected versus Pinnacle-adjacent watersheds, visual evidence so compelling it temporarily silenced even the most vocal Pinnacle supporters. The meeting stretched into evening as neighbors who had known each other their entire lives found themselves on opposite sides of a divide that cut through friendships, church congregations, and even families. The tension occasionally erupting into heated exchanges before Marco, leveraging his journalistic objectivity, proposed a community oversight committee to independently verify all claims before the town took an official position. As the exhausted crowd finally dispersed into the night, Lucas observed the division reflected in their very movements. Pinnacle supporters clustered around company representatives offering reassurances about job opportunities and environmental safeguards, while environmental advocates gathered around Thomas and Eleanor, organizing water testing volunteers and planning a weekend hike to witness the Sanctuary Valley firsthand. The battle lines drawn not between strangers but among neighbors whose shared history on the mountain was now testing the resilience of community bonds that had weathered generations of hardship together. The mountain dawn had barely broken when Lucas, Marco, and Thomas approached the public trail leading to the contested watershed area. Their planned water sampling expedition suddenly halted when Ranger froze, hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared intently down the path where nothing appeared visibly wrong to human eyes. Tendrils of morning mist still clung to the forest floor. The early birdsong suddenly silenced, as if nature itself sensed something amiss in the usually peaceful woodland. Trusting the German shepherd's superior senses, Lucas held the group back while Ranger investigated, the dog's behavior growing increasingly agitated as he circled a section of disturbed ground before darting into the underbrush and emerging with a torn piece of Lucas's school backpack clutched gently in his teeth, his amber eyes reflecting intelligence and concern that transcended ordinary canine awareness. Thomas frowned in confusion as Lucas confirmed he had lost no such item, his hand instinctively gripping his son's shoulder protectively as they exchanged worried glances, prompting Marco to edge carefully forward and discover an elaborate scene apparently staged during the night. Lucas's missing science project folder lay scattered around the forest floor near recently damaged monitoring equipment bearing Pinnacle logos, alongside tools with the Reed family name engraved on them that Thomas recognized as having been stolen from their shed the previous week. The carefully arranged tableau too perfect in its incriminating composition to be anything but deliberately orchestrated. "They're setting us up," Marco whispered, camera already documenting the clearly fabricated crime scene while careful to touch nothing. His journalist's instincts immediately recognizing the sinister implications, creating evidence of vandalism and sabotage they can use to discredit your testimony and potentially file criminal charges, possibly even separating Lucas from his father through family services interventions, if they can make a case for parental negligence. Ranger continued patrolling the perimeter with military precision, alerting to fresh human scents leading away from the trail toward a concealed blind where sophisticated camera equipment had been positioned to capture anyone who approached the planted evidence. The trap clearly designed to photograph Lucas or his father handling the damaged equipment and planted tools, completing the frame with seemingly irrefutable visual proof of their guilt. With growing understanding of the scheme, Thomas contacted Sheriff Brannigan, a family friend uninvolved with Pinnacle's influence network whose 20 years of law enforcement experience had left him skeptical of corporate interests, who arrived to officially document the scene before it could be altered further. His experienced eye immediately recognizing the staged nature of the evidence, as he methodically collected samples and photographs that would later prove crucial in unraveling the conspiracy. The sheriff's investigation revealed boot prints matching Pinnacle security personnel's distinctive tactical footwear and trace evidence, suggesting the equipment had been damaged elsewhere before being placed along the public trail. Laboratory analysis later identifying industrial lubricants specific to Pinnacle's maintenance facility. Discoveries that transformed Pinnacle's trap into a devastating backfire, as Marco's newspaper published front-page photographs of the company's attempted frame job, alongside formal statements from the sheriff's office, confirming the fabricated nature of the scene and raising questions about potential criminal conspiracy charges against those responsible. Community sentiment shifted dramatically following the revelation, with even former Pinnacle supporters expressing outrage at the corporation's willingness to potentially criminalize a 10-year-old boy in their desperation to discredit the environmental evidence. Lifelong company defenders like Pastor Williams publicly withdrawing support during Sunday services and the miners' union issuing a statement condemning tactics that target children in pursuit of profit, while the company's hastily issued denial, claiming rogue elements had acted without authorization, was contradicted by security camera footage from a local gas station, showing Pinnacle's head of security directing vehicles near Colorants. The trail during the pre-dawn hours when the false evidence was planted. Lucas scratched behind Ranger's ears with profound gratitude that night, offering the loyal dog extra treats and whispering words of praise as he reflected on how the German Shepherd's remarkable instincts had not only protected them from a devastating setup, but had transformed Pinnacle's desperate tactic into perhaps their most significant strategic mistake, creating a documented instance of corporate malfeasance that lent credibility to all their other allegations, and raising uncomfortable questions about what additional lengths Pinnacle might have gone to in silencing Sarah Reed's original investigation, questions that would eventually lead investigators to re-examine the circumstances of her fatal accident with renewed suspicion and forensic resources. The Mountain Herald's special edition hit newsstands with unprecedented impact, its front page dominated by Marco's meticulously researched exposé titled "The Price of Silence, Corporate Greed, Environmental Destruction, and the Death of Sarah Reed," accompanied by damning photographs from Sarah's recovered camera and comprehensive documentation of Pinnacle's illegal operations. Within hours, digital versions of the story spread across social media platforms, environmental websites, and news aggregators, transforming a local controversy into a national conversation about corporate accountability and environmental justice. Marco had strategically coordinated the article's release with major national outlets, resulting in simultaneous coverage from television networks whose camera crews descended upon the small mountain town, their satellite trucks lining Main Street as reporters sought interviews with Lucas, Thomas, Eleanor, and other community members, while Pinnacle executives issued increasingly desperate no comments through harried public relations representatives. The Environmental Protection Agency announced a formal investigation within 24 hours of the story breaking, their hazardous materials team arriving to conduct independent water and soil testing throughout the watershed while temporarily suspending all Pinnacle operations pending regulatory review. Their unusually swift response attributed to the overwhelming photographic evidence and precise documentation Sarah Reed had compiled before her death. National environmental organizations mobilized with remarkable coordination, the Sierra Club filing emergency injunctions against Pinnacle's permits, while the Natural Resources Defense Council assembled a legal team to represent affected community members in a class action lawsuit demanding comprehensive remediation of contaminated areas and medical monitoring for residents showing symptoms of toxin exposure. Wall Street reacted with predictable ruthlessness to the unfolding scandal. Pinnacle Resources stock plummeting 27% in the first day of trading following the story's publication, triggering automatic trading halts as institutional investors frantically divested their holdings amid analyst projections of catastrophic regulatory fines, cleanup costs, and potential criminal liability for executives implicated in Sarah Reed's death and the subsequent cover-up attempts. Corporate damage control efforts backfired spectacularly when Pinnacle's hastily called press conference featured Harrington attempting to discredit Lucas as an emotionally traumatized child manipulated by environmental extremists, prompting immediate backlash as social media users shared the heartbreaking image of the 10-year-old boy holding his mother's research journals beside her recovered camera, his quiet dignity contrasting sharply with the corporation's aggressive deflection tactics. Senator Katherine Jennings, chair of the Environmental Oversight Committee, announced public hearings on regulatory failures that had allowed Pinnacle's violations to continue unchecked for years, specifically citing evidence that the corporation had operated through an elaborate network of shell companies to circumvent permitting requirements while systematically contaminating watersheds across 5 states. Local impacts proved equally dramatic as Pine Ridge citizens witnessed their community becoming the symbolic center of a national movement, with environmental activists establishing a protest camp at the boundary of Pinnacle's main facility, while counter-demonstrations by employees fearful of losing their livelihoods created tension that required state police intervention. The town's division reflecting America's broader struggle to balance economic needs with environmental protection. Throughout the media firestorm, Lucas maintained a quiet presence at the center, occasionally providing interviews alongside his father but primarily focusing on ensuring his mother's research received proper scientific attention, her methodology validated by independent experts who confirmed her findings regarding contamination patterns and ecological impacts, transforming Sarah Reed posthumously from a local conservationist into a whistleblower whose sacrifice had exposed corporate malfeasance with nationwide implications for environmental regulation and enforcement. The county courthouse's grand chamber fell silent as Lucas approached the witness stand, his small frame nearly disappearing behind the massive oak podium, while camera shutters clicked rapidly to capture the moment when a 10-year-old boy prepared to testify against one of the region's most powerful corporations. Thomas and Eleanor sat in the front row, their encouraging nod steadying Lucas as he was sworn in before the Special Environmental Hearing Committee comprised of state officials, federal regulators, and local authorities responsible for determining Pinnacle's permit status. Lucas's voice, initially soft but growing stronger with each carefully chosen word, filled the hushed room as he methodically explained his mother's research methodology, the contamination patterns she had documented over 18 months, and her discovery of the sanctuary valley that provided pristine comparison samples, revealing the extent of watershed degradation in areas adjacent to Pinnacle's operations. The boy's testimony demonstrated remarkable scientific understanding as he referenced specific contaminant levels, explained bioaccumulation in affected wildlife populations, and clarified complex hydrological concepts using simple analogies that resonated with both technical experts and community members packed into the chamber. His natural teaching ability clearly inherited from the mother whose research he now presented to the world. Midway through Lucas's explanation of water testing results, the courtroom door opened to admit Pinnacle's senior executive team led by the silver-haired man from Sarah's final photographs. Their synchronized entrance clearly calculated to disrupt and intimidate as they took seats directly in Lucas's line of sight, their expressions ranging from dismissive smirks to calculated glares that would have shaken many adult witnesses. Lucas faltered momentarily, his voice catching as he recognized the exact men his mother had confronted on her final day. But then his eyes found the family photograph he had placed on the podium, Sarah's smiling face giving him strength as he continued with renewed determination, addressing the committee with the quiet conviction that characterized his mother's environmental advocacy. The Pinnacle CEO's whispered comments to his legal team grew increasingly agitated as Lucas presented the Sanctuary Valley documentation, explaining how this pristine ecosystem sitting directly above Pinnacle's desired excavation site provided irrefutable evidence of what stood to be lost. His testimony punctuated by gasps from committee members viewing photographs of endangered species thriving in the hidden valley his mother had protected with her final actions. When the corporate legal team's cross-examination began, their strategy of overwhelming the young witness with technical challenges and aggressive questioning backfired dramatically, as Lucas responded with factual precision and unshakable certainty, occasionally consulting his mother's notebooks, but mostly speaking from the deep understanding he had developed while continuing her work. The defining moment came when Pinnacle's lead attorney attempted to dismiss Lucas as an emotionally compromised child reciting rehearsed accusations, prompting Lucas to abandon his prepared statements and speak directly to the committee with tears shimmering in his eyes but his voice unwavering. "My mother taught me that facts speak for themselves if we have the courage to present them honestly, that mountains can't defend themselves against those who see them only as resources to exploit, and that standing up for truth is worth any price, including the one she ultimately paid on that trail after confronting the men sitting in this room today." The chamber erupted in supportive applause that the committee chairwoman made no attempt to silence, the spontaneous outburst reflecting the community's recognition that they were witnessing not just a boy's testimony but the living continuation of Sarah Reed's environmental legacy, spoken through her son with a courage that even Pinnacle's most intimidating executives could not suppress. Spring sunshine dappled the forest floor as Lucas stood beside Governor Mitchell at the base of Whispering Falls. The ceremonial signing of the Sarah Reed Mountain Conservation Act establishing 20,000 acres of protected wilderness, including the Sanctuary Valley and surrounding watersheds that would now be permanently shielded from riding, development, or resource extraction. The gathered crowd of community members, environmental advocates, and media representatives applauded as the governor announced the additional establishment of a research foundation funded by Pinnacle's environmental remediation settlement, ensuring ongoing scientific monitoring of the ecosystem Sarah had given her life to protect. 6 months had passed since the county hearings, months that had transformed both the mountain's future and the Reed family, as Thomas accepted a position directing the new conservation district, while Lucas found himself increasingly involved with educational programs bringing local Pimes school children to learn about watershed protection and biodiversity preservation at the research cabin, now officially designated the Sarah Reed Field Station, and equipped with modern scientific facilities funded by national environmental organizations recognizing the site's significance. On this particular afternoon, as the dedication ceremony concluded and visitors departed, Lucas remained behind with Ranger, feeling drawn to explore the cabin's main room, where conservation volunteers had carefully preserved his mother's original research setup while adding new monitoring equipment. Something about the angle of sunlight through the western window revealed what countless previous examinations had missed, a subtle irregularity in the wooden wall paneling beside his mother's desk. Lucas's fingers discovered a nearly invisible seam leading to a small compartment containing a sealed envelope with his name written in his mother's handwriting, somehow overlooked during their earlier discoveries, yet perfectly positioned to be revealed only when the spring sunlight reached this precise angle, suggesting Sarah had created this final hiding place with deliberate timing in mind. The letter inside contained words that brought fresh tears yet profound peace. "My dearest Lucas, if you're reading this, then somehow you've done what I always believed you could. Continuing the work that matters most, becoming the protector these mountains need, just as I always saw in you, even when you were too young to recognize it in yourself. What matters isn't whether I'm physically present to see your accomplishments, but that you've discovered your own connection to this place we've both loved so deeply, finding healing and purpose just as I always have." Lucas sat in his mother's chair, Ranger's head resting on his knee as he absorbed her final message, understanding now with perfect clarity that his journey to save the mountain had simultaneously been his path toward healing. Each water sample collected and each piece of evidence secured, not just protecting the ecosystem, but gradually restoring his shattered heart through purposeful action that honored Sarah's legacy while allowing him to find his own identity as both her son and now her successor. As afternoon light bathed the cabin in golden warmth, Lucas realized the true gift his mother had left wasn't just the protected mountain or even her scientific research, but the understanding that healing from loss comes not from forgetting but from continuing what matters most to those we've lost. His conservation work becoming both tribute and therapy. a living memorial more meaningful than any monument could ever be, looking out toward the sanctuary valley now permanently protected in his mother's name. Lucas finally felt the peace that had eluded him since her death, recognizing that in saving his mother's beloved mountains, he had also saved himself.